Would you believe me if I said your body is intelligent? Well, science says that our bodies know a lot more than we realize. And if we can learn to listen to them, we can tap into that deeper internal wisdom. And thankfully, today's guest is an expert in the mind-body connection. And she's here to help us develop the sensory awareness to be our best. Today's guest is Dr. Amanda Blake. Amanda is an internationally celebrated educator and executive coach with a pedigree spanning more than 25 years and 35,000 students in companies, nonprofits, colleges and universities, professional associations, and more. She has shown people in over 50 countries how they can enjoy life more while making a bigger contribution, and has reached many thousands more as a top-rated podcast guest with her award-winning book, Your Body is Your Brain. She's also a master somatic coach, and her primary research areas are the neurobiology of embodied learning, applied ethics, and leadership effectiveness. Now, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I share new episodes and other tips for managers every week. Now, here's the conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mandy. I'm so excited to talk about a topic that I don't think I've ever covered on the show before. And also that makes me a little uncomfortable, which does not usually happen. Usually I'm like, oh, we're going to talk about feedback and conflict and like, this is going to be great. And I'm like, oh, we're going to talk about like how we feel in our bodies. I'll avoid that one.
You know what? We can talk about feedback and conflict because how we feel in our bodies totally affects how we show up when we're delegating, negotiating. And yeah, right on.
Yes. Okay, why don't you start by laying some groundwork for us about the topic of, I don't even actually know officially what to call it, like somatic and body embodiment. Like, what are we actually talking about today?
So I like to talk about embodied intelligence. My book, Your Body is Your Brain, refers to somatic intelligence. Really, it's all the same thing, which is that we actually have intelligence out, and I literally mean intelligence, out to our fingers and toes. We know things through our embodied sensations, even through the way we physically sit, stand, move in the workplace, in our homes. We know things and we take action that way through our bodies. And there's no switching that off. That is on 24/7. But what's interesting is nobody has ever taught us, A, that that's true, B, how to use it well, and C, how to use it well in a workplace context. So some of us might be athletes or go to yoga or do other kinds of physical things like playing music or theater might be a hobby, right? So any of these things are very physical. We might be very physical in other parts of our lives, just playing with our kids or whatever. That's very different from using your body as the antenna that it is to pick up on signals, and your body's always sending you signals about what's going on in this situation. How might I respond effectively to this situation? We actually have intelligence that can help us that we're leaving on the table.
Yes. And I love the section in your book where you were connecting like the different types of that internal sources of knowledge with the kind of common sayings that we have and how that those phrases, those sayings, things like sick to my stomach, right? Or heartbroken, like they actually come from somewhere. They're not random. Can you kind of just talk us through that and help us understand what are some of these different senses and sources of intelligence in our bodies?
What you're referring to there, these phrases that come up, like we'll say someone was spineless, or we'll say, oh, I got really hot, when what we mean is I got angry, right? That we actually can't understand the world. This comes from linguistics and cognitive science. We can't understand anything about the world without understanding it in embodied terms. So if I ask you to point to the future, where is the future in relation to you right now? I mean, I'm literally asking.
Forward, like in front of me?
So there's not a right answer to that. But in our culture that we share, North American culture, most people will point in front of them. And we have a sense of like the future means moving forward, right? So, and it is a sense, and I use that term deliberately, right? We have a sense, and it is something that we kind of, we might have an idea about it, but it's something that we also physically feel. There are cultures that will point behind them. The future is unknown. I can't see it, but I can see laid out before me everything that has happened in the past. Interesting, right? I'm watching your expression. Like,
yeah.
Right? So my point here is there's actually no way for us to understand the world except in embodied terms. And what that means is that almost everything that we do can be understood via the landscape of embodied cognition, or what cognition means is essentially knowing about the world and being able to decide what to do in it, right? Cognition is about managing our behavior in response to incoming information. So humans are not the only cognitive creatures on the planet, right? Lots of other creatures, even without our linguistic capabilities, have cognitive capabilities. It's why we can study animal models and understand things about the brain, right? Or understand things about behavior. So this capacity for embodied cognition, trust me, it's working all the time while you're at work. And it's nowhere more so, I want to say nowhere more so than in management, nowhere more so than when we are responsible for helping people work effectively together. Because a lot of our embodied cognition has been shaped both sort of historically, evolutionarily. The brain, as it develops, if you look at evolutionary biology, but also if you look at developmental biology, so just our everyday, everybody grows up from being a child to an adult, right? So over long spans of time, as well as over the span of a lifetime, we see that the brain is really highly oriented towards making sense of our social relationships. There's a ton of brain real estate devoted to that. And all of it is tied to our sensory capacities as well. So these things are tied together in ways that we can't see and aren't always aware of, but they're always affecting our actions.
So given that we are learning over time, our brain is developing over time, and it's being influenced by all of our different experiences, could you maybe share a little bit or give us some stories about what happens to us over the course of our lifetime, gets embedded into our body, and then shapes our perception of the world, or kind of shapes how we then experience the world?
Yeah, that's great. So this is something that is, again, it's switched on all the time. So we can't not do this. And what happens is, so the brain is considered the least differentiated organ at birth, meaning compared to all our other body parts, the brain is going to change more than any other part of our body from birth to adulthood. And it not only changes its wiring and its connections, it actually develops kind of new structures and thickens certain areas. And so it's really physically taking shape. Like if you look at your hand, you're going to wind up with the same bone structure in adulthood that you had as a child. But the brain is quite different. It will change quite a bit. And there are parts of our brain that don't mature, come online until much later in life. And meanwhile, we are being shaped, we'll say, by the environment that we live in. So our school environment, our home environment, our wider cultural environment, what country we grew up in, what sort of subculture we grew up in, whether it's a religious subculture or an ethnic subculture, right? So all of these things, we're immersed in these as children. And the parts of our brain that are most mature as children are the sensory parts, the parts for sensation and movement. Those, when we come into the world, are already almost fully formed. Parts for language, obviously not. It takes us a while to acquire that. Parts for kind of logical reasoning, obviously not. It takes us a while to acquire those capacities. But the parts for sensation and movement are always switched on. And so we're always almost like drinking in from our environment. Here's how it feels to be in relationship with these people around me. Here's how I move in relationship to these people around me. So we adopt and acquire, both in childhood and throughout our lives, ways of being, behavioral habits, what I sometimes call biobehavioral blind spots. They could be strengths. sometimes their limitations, right? That we put on autopilot. The brain is a pattern detection instrument, and it wants to put as much as possible on autopilot. So early in life, we're putting a lot of behavioral responses on autopilot. So if you grew up, for example, in a circumstance where people laughed at you a lot and you were laughed at and not laughed with, much later, you're in a meeting and a bunch of people burst into laughter, maybe your heart starts to beat fast because you learned way earlier in life, oh, this fast beating heart, this is like people laughing, that's maybe a risky situation for me. Now, it may or may not be in this particular workplace situation, but we may pick up on something that could be an accurate or an inaccurate read of a situation based on our embodied responses. And then we'll make all kinds of decisions about how to, very swiftly, very unconsciously, we'll make all kinds of decisions about how to respond to that laughter. So we might laugh along with, or feel a little meek and kind of look down at the table, or tell everybody to shut up, or, right? There are lots of ways that we might respond. And sometimes what we're responding to is physical discomfort inside ourselves that we just want to make go away. And so we'll tell everybody to shut up, or what. And if we have learn other skills, other strategies to go, oh, there's discomfort here that may or may not be telling me the truth. I'm going to learn, it takes some time to learn how to discern in our own bodies when we're getting an accurate read of the world versus a read that's maybe been, we could say, miseducated, right? We learned a lesson that isn't so helpful for us now.
So what you're saying, like, there's so many signals that are happening in our bodies. And if we're not paying attention to them, it's really hard to be aware enough to assess and then make deliberate choices, because we're basically running on autopilot. And this may be silly, but like, it reminds me when I am doing Peloton classes and there's different instructors will say things like, relax your shoulders. And I'm like, I didn't even know that my shoulders were doing this while I was riding, right? Or like, relax your brow. And I'm like, oh, I didn't even know I was like tensing my eyebrows. Like, wiggle your toes. I'm like, oh my gosh, I was cramping my toes. Like, I wasn't even realizing what was happening in my body because I was so intent on the activity that was, that I was doing at the moment, riding this bike. And I feel like it is so hard for us sometimes to realize those sensations in our bodies, or at least I will say for myself, it is very hard. So are there things that we can do to start to build greater awareness of those emotional and physical sensations? I'm guessing that's the place that we need to start with is getting more body awareness.
What you're describing is so super, super, super normal. It is more normal to not be aware that your brow is furrowed than to be aware of it. Whether you're on the Peloton bike or concentrating at your desk, right? It's much more normal to not be aware. And part of that is by biological design. So where we can put our own internal sensations on autopilot, we do. And then we also have all these cultural messages that say, ignore, 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 right? So there are lots of things that have our interior sensory life be just very dampened and very quiet. And that's normal. And I just want to say, fine, like it's totally fine. But the other thing, if you don't mind, before I answer your question of how, I'd like to kind of point to why, because like, why bother, getting better at sensory awareness? What does it actually offer you? And this actually isn't in the book. This is in more recent research that I've done, concluded a couple of years ago, that shows that as you develop embodied self-awareness, you also develop the emotional and social intelligence that leaders need to do an outstanding job, right? Like, I know one of the things that you point out is that people tend not to leave jobs, they leave managers, right? They leave people that they feel are not treating them well. And so the kinds of emotional and social intelligence capacities that we need, things like resilience and adaptability in today's crazy environment, things like the ability to manage conflict well or to empathize, these kinds of things, research has shown, come along with growing embodied self-awareness. So it's a worthwhile effort. It's a worthwhile undertaking for those of us who work inside of organizations and whose job it is to work well with other people and help other people work well together, right? Okay, so that's why. And then the question is how? Let me give you a couple of very practical things you can do. One thing you can do is take like some really flat lentils, take a little sprinkle, put them in your shoes, and walk around with lentils in your shoes all day. Not like really huge, bumpy lentils that are I have super sensitive feet, so I just use the really tiny ones. They'll slide around in your shoes, and it's enough to get you paying attention. Oh, my feet are making contact with the ground all the time, right? Most of the day. I mean, maybe sometimes I sit on the couch with my feet tucked up under me. Most of the time, my feet are on the ground. Those lentils will slide around. They'll help you get more connected to the sensations of your feet, the sensations of your legs. And in that way, we talk about being, in sort of popular terms, we'll talk about, oh, I need to go get more grounded now. Well, this is a really practical way to do it, right? It's to actually wake up to the sensations in your feet and in your legs. And it'll keep you paying attention all day. I have another one too, but let me stop there and see what you have to say in response.
No, I love that. I never would have thought to put lentils in my shoes. So I'm excited to try that. Why don't you just tell us what the second one is, and then I'll take us in a new direction.
Okay, that sounds good. So another thing that you can do is you could probably find lists online, and I would steer you away from doing that. Instead, think up as many words to describe sensation as possible. Usually when I do this, when I suggest this, people will say things like anxiety, excitement, fear. Those are not sensations, right? Those are words that describe an interpretation of a sensation. A sensation is physical. It's something like heat, sweating, chilly. So we're really looking for things like a rapid heartbeat or a pulsing or a weightiness or a lightness or a sense of expansiveness or a sense of tension, right? If you're just going to describe furrowed brow, you might say concentrating, but that's not furrowed brow, right? So really, one of the reasons that I said like we tune sensation out both biologically and culturally, we tend to do that, but also we tend not to have very good language for it. So make a list for yourself of as many physical sensations as you possibly can. Keep it near you on your desk or on your phone, and just pull it out a few times a day. Circle a few things that you're feeling. That'll start to direct your attention more and more. It'll start to build your embodied self-awareness, your capacity for present moment, non-judgmental attention to sensation and motion, which is the academic definition of that term.
Oh, I love this. And one of the things that I was just thinking about doing when you were describing this, I was like, oh, I feel like I want to set a timer like randomly on my watch. And then when it goes off, be like, okay, what is my body doing right now? Like, where am I feeling tense? Where am I feeling relaxed? How is my head tilted? Like, what's happening? And like, what's my emotional experience? Am I deep in concentration? Am I feeling annoyed at about something that I'm reading? Like, what is happening? And what's the emotion experience? And what's the physical experience of that? So maybe that's like another thing I'll try doing.
Perfect. Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. I wonder if you can share some stories or a story about yourself or about a client, and what was this process like for them to go from kind of unawareness to awareness to kind of changed body, changed emotions, changed mental state? Because I want to get us to the place of like, how do we make the changes once we are aware? But I want to maybe hear a story first.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, one of the things that I often say is, awareness creates choice, but it's practice that creates capacity. So awareness is just the first step, but then getting into a regular practice of doing something different, that's where the real power of this approach can really make a difference. Why don't I use an example? Someone who was super driven by her to-do list and very much in overwhelm. She happened to be a consultant, so she didn't work inside of a company. She wasn't a manager. Actually, I had 2 clients where this was a really huge issue, and all of us can relate to having too much to do, right? This is maybe going to sound corny or hokey, but what we ultimately came to after exploring, where does she feel relaxed instead of compelled, right? So she had this sense of like, I'm compelled by my to-do list. And in both her case and the other client that I worked with on this specific issue, both of them were really compromising family relationships as a result of this compulsion, right? My actions, my behaviors are like, I have to do more work. I have to keep up with this. And of course, we all have tons of demands on our times. And there are times when we actually have to really do something. But as a consultant, she actually had a lot of leeway to choose. And when I asked her, where do you feel the opposite of that compulsion? Where do you feel the most at ease? She talked about walking with her dogs. And what we explored is like when she was walking with her dogs, and I had her go out and walk with her dogs and pay attention, right? She had really like open across her chest and collarbones. Her shoulders were dropped. You were talking about that earlier, right, on the Peloton. And she just felt really relaxed across the front of her chest. And almost like she was, even though she was walking, almost like she was like leaning back or she could look up. She just felt all this space in front of her. And so one of the things that we started to do is and explore was when she sat down in front of her computer to make that space. So to open across the chest and collarbones and to look up, right? And to see like the horizon, the wider world, not just her computer. And she ultimately added to that a gesture of leaning back in her chair, putting her hand on her chest and just saying to herself, I am enough, right? And there was a whole history around this, right? But I am enough. Really different from another fellow that I worked with who was one of the smartest people I've ever met, who worked with equally smart people and more so, and who felt intimidated by the people that he worked with. And really knew he had been hired to kind of elbow into this room full of smart people and make a contribution. But he found himself hanging back a lot, being the quiet one in the room, worrying that maybe what he had to contribute wasn't quite as sharp, wasn't quite as shiny. And so similarly, we explored, where do you feel more of a sense of confidence? Where do you feel more of a sense of the kind of contribution that you want to make? And he talked about walking with his son on a trail and putting his son, who was quite small at the time, on his shoulders and sort of feeling like the additional weight into the ground, like I'm going to pick up this person, I'm going to carry this weight. But similarly for him, an openness happens to be an openness across the chest, right? And so what we wound up designing a practice for him that was around feeling weightiness opening across the chest. And he came up with a phrase, my purpose is service. And with that phrase and that physicality, he was able to step into these meetings where he was intimidated in a much more powerful way. And then I'll give you one more, very simple. She worked inside of an organization. She needed to set more boundaries at work and at home. She was doing some caregiving for a family member who was very demanding, and there were caregiving responsibilities that needed to be met, and then there were demands on top of that, right? And so one of the things that we worked with for her was coming up with both a phrase and a movement that was about setting boundaries. She had a rolling chair at work, as many of us do. And I had her stand up in front of the chair and push the chair away and simply say, no, we did this at home first, where she was not like around all of her colleagues, right? But just have the chair in front of her, push the chair away so that she could feel herself physically making space in front of her. And in a sense, making a boundary, push the chair away and say no, or no, thank you, or I'm unable to do that now. So this pairing of our linguistic self, right? Like we might be able to say something like, we might be able to learn a bunch of words like, I can't help you right now, or no, if you want me to make that a priority, I have to drop this other priority. Like, we can learn a lot of really great phrases. We shouldn't stop doing that. It's really, really helpful. But if in the moment when your boss comes to you and says, I need you to XYZ, and you're like, wow, there's no feasible way I can add that to my plate and also still, feed my children this evening, whatever it is, to be able to have a physical sensation that goes along with, we need to discuss priorities, and to say that with gravitas, with lentils in your shoes, with a sense of, we talked about spinelessness before, with a sense of strong back, soft heart, right? Like, I'm firm here. I'm connectable. I want to connect with you. All of that gets communicated in very nonverbal ways.
Oh my gosh. Yes. All right. I'm going to say a couple of quick things before we have to wrap up. So first is, I love the strategy that you just shared through these stories of identify when you're feeling small or tight and it's in your body, right? When you're not at your best. And then imagine the opposite. Where are the places where you feel the opposite, and what does your body feel like there? And now let's bring intentionally that body posture, that body movement, that body sensation into those spaces and times where you're feeling the opposite, right? Like, that's such a great strategy that everyone can start using. The second is this connection between words and body sensation, like words and physical. And that, especially for those of us who tend to live in our heads, that feels like a nice way to kind of bring these two parts of ourselves together. So just want to lift that up. And then thirdly, with this last story you were just sharing, right? It goes back to us being on autopilot, right? Like, we might know the words, but getting yourself to say the words when your entire body and your life experience has led you to do the opposite is not so easy. And so just knowing the words isn't enough, right? We're actually, what you're describing is trying to rewire our bodies in a way that allow us to say the words that we know we want to say and we know we should say and are the right thing to do. But all of these other parts of us are saying that's not what we should be doing. So just yes.
And I just want to say, like, so very often when we know what to say and we don't say it, it's because we're uncomfortable saying it. And that is a physical experience. If you can find a way to intervene in that physical experience, to expand your capacity to tolerate the discomfort for a moment, and to practice shifting out of that into something that is more comfortable, you will be more able to say the words. It's true in my life. It's true in clients' lives. It's so powerful. It's why I do the work that I do, because my life was totally upended in the most positive of all possible ways by doing this kind of work.
And when it comes to the workplace, there are so many places, right? We talked about giving feedback, dealing with conflict, right? Speaking up in a meeting where you're not sure how your ideas are going to land, right? All those places where we feel those physical sensations of holding us back, right? What a difference it would be if we learn how to accept those sensations and move forward anyways and say what we want to say. Just so powerful. All right. We have to wrap up though. So Mandy, can you share with us a great manager that you worked for and what made this person such a fabulous boss?
Oh, you bet. Hands down. Eric Wood. I worked for him at 2 different companies. And I will say 2 things. One is he was totally upfront about his strengths and weaknesses, to the point of introducing himself with a PowerPoint complete with strengths and weaknesses. Here's what you can expect from me, including the ways I'm going to fail you. Just help me work around those. So he was absolutely wonderful. And the other thing that he did was he offered a lot of trust and was always there to back us up. So go do your thing. He was great about clearly setting direction and then offering a tremendous amount of trust combined with support. He wasn't going to let us fail, and was absolutely going to let us do our jobs.
So amazing. And I love that PowerPoint idea. I might steal that.
Yeah, it was very memorable.
Awesome. And where can people learn more about you? Remind us the title of your book and where people can find it and all that good stuff.
Yeah. So Your Body is Your Brain is available at bookstores worldwide. Have at it. you can find a lot more information, including tons of free practices on the Embright website. So go to embright.org. I imagine I'll put the link in the show notes. That's EMBRIGHT, embright.org is where you can find all kinds of free stuff and other goodies too.
Fabulous. Well, thank you again for this fascinating conversation. And I already said I'm going to put lentils in my shoes. I can't wait to try it out.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me. This has been really fun.